everybody. Gurmajos! Cheers to everybody out there. Thank you for joining me on this excellent new series here on Wine with Jimmy. This is looking at the superb, the historical and wonderful wines of Georgia. Really delighted to bring you this series. It's a country I have visited. I adore the variety of wines, including skin contact, amber, orange wines, if you must. We are going to be going through the whole industry of Georgia. And here you are. It's a multi-part series coming at you at YouTube, all free content to really get you enthused for this wonderful nation that really lays claim to have the oldest wine producing country in the world. So you'll see here, it's a multi-part series that stems through things like history, climate, topography, the lay of the land, geology and soils, viticulture, key grape varieties, winemaking styles, and then, of course, key appellations, PDO status. We're also going to throw in some great producers and gastronomy on this as well. As always, if you have any comments, any questions, any concerns, please get in touch. You can comment on this video below. Maybe you have tried some Georgian wines and maybe you've visited. We'd love to hear about your experiences, what you like, the styles of wines you prefer, and if you are like me, kind of obsessed with Kvevery skin contact examples, please do get in touch. Make sure you click the like button because it helps Wine with Jimmy, and make sure you click subscribe because it helps you with regular updates from this channel. You will also find social media at the bottom of every slide, so you can get in touch via that means as well if you are that way inclined. Okay, so really excited to bring you all of this wonderful information. On this presentation, we are looking at the history. It's a broad sweep across the history of Georgia, with information also included about how it started to shape the wine industry here. So we'll bring in the important historical aspect of the wine industry of Georgia. Okay, so first up, its location. Where are we looking? We are not looking at the southern United States of America. It is made as a bit of a confusion point, I suppose. Some people do believe that we're talking about Georgia in the south of these states, but we're not. We are here just to the east of the Black Sea, south of Russia, north of Turkey, and then close to countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is Georgia here. This shape, as we see, from the Black Sea all the way across. And it really is at a crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The spice route famously comes through here, means that you get really everything you can ever imagine in Georgia because it has its Western and it has its Eastern influences. Quite amazing. And that's also a really important point to make in terms of wine styles. When describing the wines of Georgia, especially those that are made through skin contact, our Kvevery typical styles, you will find that you really need to broaden your spectrum of vocabulary because of the influences this country can have. So typically you'll find things like fenugreek in the wine and paprika and wonderful arrays of spices. Now, its geographically strategic location means that it has had an exceptional amount of influences from all surrounding nations and empires. We, of course, have had the Turkish influence through the Arabs and the Ottoman Empire, the Persian influence with Iran, and, of course, Russians above it, which arguably still has a very significant influence, certainly in the northern parts, and also Mongolia with the Golden Horde, the likes of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan coming through these lands, of course. So yes, that's its strategic location. The importance of wine here, we often, you will hear with Georgia, it is credited with having the oldest winemaking, or the records of it, in the world, dating back to 6000 BC. And the word wine likely comes from the Georgian word gvino, so Ghvino. Now, grape pips belonging to Vitis vinifera were discovered in Kartli. Kartli is the region that surrounds the capital city of Tbilisi. So this is in our sort of central to eastern Georgia. And it was discovered by archaeologists dating to the first cultivated grapevines around the 6 millennia BC. The archaeological discoveries that were found were grape pips of Vitis vinifera sativa, which is a domesticated grapevine, clay vessels, possibly precursors to the Kvevrey. Here you'll see a wonderful gentleman here standing next to, proudly next to a Kvevrey, the clay pot, clay and made in Georgia. Deposits of calcium salts of tartaric acid, e.g., from wine. And also, grapes were depicted on archaeological clay pots that were found on the vessels from that period. In 2013, UNESCO registered Kvevrey traditional winemaking on the list of intangible cultural heritage. And we can also witness a lot of key wine links within Georgian history through its art, its pottery, and also its literature as well. So we have this big claim to fame. Now, if you go next door to Armenia, Armenia has the claim of having the oldest winery, which is called the Areni 1 cave. But the evidence for Georgia is the oldest wine production. Going into the Middle Ages. Now, in the 4th century AD, the Kingdom of Iberia was established here. That's eastern Georgia, around today what we call Kakheti and Kartli. In the same century, Georgia converted to Christianity. Saint Nino arrived from Cappadocia and preached carrying a cross woven from vines tied with her hair, depicted on the left-hand side. This is still the Georgian Orthodox cross, and note the sloping arms on the left picture as well. So, wine, as we know, and Christianity is intertwined. Monasteries, monks, winemakers. The Alaverdi monastery was founded in the 6th century. Alaverdi is found towards the north of the Kakheti region. So this is the largest wine region within Georgia, situated in the east. So this is to the east of Tbilisi. Now, with the Alaverdi monastery, we find Kvevrys. They were found there dating back to the 7th and 8th century, as we have previously discussed. So from this time, wine cellars were very much in strong evidence everywhere around Georgia. Now, anarchy and unrest persisted until the areas like Abkhazia and eastern Georgian states were united under one Georgian monarch. That's Bagrat III in 978. And this starts the Bagratoni dynasty. They ruled pretty much until the 19th century within Georgia. In the 12th and 13th centuries, this is actually seen as Georgia's golden age. King David IV and his great granddaughter, Queen Tamar, who you'll see on the right-hand side of this picture, who was known as the first female ruler, known as King of Kings. The wine cellar remains in Kvevrey were found from this time. It was also a golden age for winemaking and viticulture, with a development of grape varieties, understanding of those varieties, and many wine cellars at that time being built. In the 14th and 15th centuries, after the death of George V in 1302, the structured and unified Georgian kingdom disintegrated. So it had a period of stability, but unfortunately, at the end of the reign of George V, this ended. And local rulers fought for independence. It's a familiar story throughout history. Lots of anarchy ensued, and separate kingdoms such as Imereti, Kartli, Kakheti, and other semi-independent principalities were established. And it meant that they were easily exploited by external forces, because no longer is this one structure, one country that can protect itself. It's an interwarring number of factions. And this meant, of course, outside can influence a lot more. The wine culture endured, however, throughout all of these incursions. Vineyards and wine cellars being rebuilt, replanted, and often on higher mountainsides where the invaders were less likely to influence and or discover the Kvevari around those times. Okay, coming into more modern times. Now we are looking around the 18th century on this slide onwards. Persia towards the east and the Ottomans in the south and the west. Those empires continued to subjugate Georgia into the 18th century. But they, of course, were also fighting each other for domination of the landscape. Even when under Persian and Ottoman rule, where alcohol was not always permitted due to religious laws, wine production in Georgia still managed to continue. And this reflects similarities in places like Spain and Sicily, when Arabs would move their way up. So the Moors, the Arabs, the Saracens, and the Berbers would influence these areas. Wine production still existed, but to a lesser extent than previous. Until the 18th century, the Caucasus Mountains had protected Georgia from Russia. This is the natural border to the north. It is called the Greater Caucasus Mountain Range because it is a gigantic natural barrier. But under Catherine the Great, who we have pictured here on this slide, and her expansionist policies, Georgia, of course, became an immediate interest for Russia. In 1783, the kingdom of Kartli Kakheti, today kind of eastern parts of Georgia, became a protectorate of Russia under the Treaty of Georgievsk, in an attempt to be protected from incursions from other empires. However, with attentions elsewhere, Russia didn't help when Iran invaded in 1795, violently working their way through, capturing Tbilisi and causing atrocities and massacring many people. In 1801, annexed by the Russians, Kartli and Kakheti were at the subjugation of the Russians, folding it into the Russian Empire. Also, other areas such as Samegrelo and Abkhazia and Svaneti were also incorporated into Georgia around that time. So this is in the middle of the 19th century. Georgia remained under Russian influence until the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Georgian population, due to a lot of these incursions, these invasions, these massacres, seriously diminished at this time, and it actually had dwindled to less than 1 million by the end of the 19th century. Okay, on to the 19th century history here. We see more European influence in Georgian winemaking. That's mainly from immigrants from Europe bringing their knowledge, but also those within Georgia traveling elsewhere. And on the left-hand side, you'll see Prince Alexander Sheshevadze, who introduced European winemaking styles to Georgia. He built the famous underground wine cellar at Zinandali, with both kveveries and oak barrels within it in the 1830s. In the 1870s, we have another prince, Prince Ivane Mukrabatoni. He traveled to Champagne and Bordeaux, bringing back, of course, knowledge, practices, techniques into his family estate in Kartli. Now that's called today Chateau Mukrani. And of course, bringing these European styles. They began exporting wines to countries like France, Poland, and of course, Russia. In 1882, Zachariah Georgiadze, part of the Bagratoni family, studied winemaking in both France and Vienna, Austria. He was an important figure in Georgian viticulture, combining traditional and modern winemaking. So things like building wine cellars, kvevery cellars, oak barrels, and he's also a very successful marketeer, showcasing Georgian wines across Europe. So very important in terms of expanding the reach of Georgian wine. In the 1850s and 1860s, like elsewhere in Western Europe, it's a series of pandemics, powdery, downy mildews, and also phylloxera. So you'll find that places like Western Georgia on the Black Sea, being warm and humid, are a bit of a breeding ground for fungal diseases. And of course, the spread of these diseases coming from the Americas took hold very quickly in those places. Phylloxera, of course, attacked the whole country because that's what it does. It spreads rapidly and it, of course, eats rootstocks. The completion and the fix against phylloxera was American rootstocks. Georgia didn't have the resources, the knowledge to actually implement that grafting procedure. So not everything was replaced. And of course, phylloxera therefore significantly diminishes the volume that is produced from Georgia. In the 1880s, so bringing towards the end of the 19th century, we have the first Georgian branded wines. They are appearing in local and foreign markets, including Sinandali, which, remember, was established in the 1820s by Prince Alexander Sheshevadze, who we've got in that picture on the left-hand side. That was first labelled in 1886. By the Paris exhibition of 1900, Georgian wine had already held quite a respectable place in European culture. All right, lots of red in the next couple of slides when we have the influence of Russia. So after the 1917 revolution in Russia, Georgia becomes a part of the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, the TDFR, along with Armenia and Azerbaijan, which sits to its sort of southeast. Georgia declares independence in May 1918. During this brief period of independence, wine cooperatives and community businesses were further developed. In 1921, the Red Army enters Georgia and incorporates Georgia into the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. They like these mass terminologies. That's along with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and becomes a founding member of the USSR in 1922. There are nationalist uprisings continuing up to 1924, and the Russians consolidate their power with violence, with these kind of put downs of these uprisings, murdering nobility and clergy alike. 1900 to 1920, the total vineyard area in Georgia had halved. It was a tough time at the end of the 19th century due to the mildews and phylloxera. And then, of course, we've got the social political problems of the early 20th century. In Kakheti, which is today the major part of Georgia, it declines by 70%, leaving the peasants who previously relied on vines for income living in sort of semi-subsistence or subsistence lifestyles. The Bolsheviks saw wine as a way of placating unhappy peasants, whilst also gaining taxes for the state. They worked quite heavily first on planting healthy vines that would survive, and Lenin's new economic policy encouraged private wine growing, encouraging the peasants to enrich themselves, as would be the way, and also the government, of course. And then Stalin takes over the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. He rebuilds Georgia's vineyards, transforming winemaking culture into an important policy. However, the private grape farmers, encouraged by the NEP to enrich themselves, were now denounced as wealthy peasants, stripped of their land and often exiled. Very, very unstable times. Now, before this brutal collectivization, many peasants lived on the hillsides, but if they were not exiled, they abandoned them. The remaining farmers were corralled into state and collective vineyards on the valley plains for, of course, voluminous production. So they had to turn their harvests over to the state, and the state dictated what varieties were grown. Georgian indigenous varieties were chosen as permitted varieties, partly because Stalin himself was Georgian, and he was known to prefer Georgian wine. Varieties that were chosen were one of volume, so high yielding, reliable, not too difficult to cultivate, and were mostly white varietals. They were wanted for mass distribution, of course, and for sparkling wine called champagne-skoy, I suppose, champagne-style wines. 1929, the Soviet wine monopoly Samtrest was established and controlling the entire wine industry from vine to wine. In the 1930s, Georgia produced approximately 60 types of wine. Let me just go to the next slide. There you go. So around 60 types of wine. In the 1950s, the first steps were taken towards Soviet industrialization, keeping only 16 varieties of grapes for wine and replacing the names of the PDOs with numbers. So, for example, Zinandali was called number 1. So, of course, this very sort of binary structured way of listing it, very unromantic, but very sort of formulaic way of strategizing the system. In 1936, the TSFSR, easier to put it in its acronym, was dissolved, and Georgia became the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. And the third 5-year plan sanctioned high-quality Georgian wine, increasing harvest, plant varieties for sparkling wine, and overall increasing quality. Research carried out in the mid-1930s to the 1960s on grape varieties and geology identified the best vineyard sites, formed a basis for the PDOs that we have today, and in the 1990s, it's still quite an important system that we have structured. We have further industrialization. Wine factories replace the previous houses, and then some tanks being instigated, stainless steel vats, and those things. Georgian wine and food was promoted by the Soviet state and seen as very prestigious. In 1962, the 10th OIV International Congress of Viticulture and Winemaking was held in Georgia. Many enterprises of winemaking were rebuilt, renovated, and in the 60s and 70s, Soviet-style mass production really took over. it was seen that Georgia would be the supplier of mass production for Russia. High yielding hybrids replaced the traditional vines. Wine factories become the norm. Chemicals were introduced, and there's a massive damage to Georgia's traditional wine industry. Let's move on to the post-Soviet era. Of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and we see an emergence of Georgia as an independent country. But of course, resulting from that, after being a part of the USSR, Georgia goes into a civil war up to 1994. Wine, of course, is not a focus during that time, and it becomes a bit of a scarce product. Now, the 1990s onwards starts to see a rebirth of traditional Georgian winemaking. So we see more of a focus on these wonderful styles like Kvevri, skin contact expressions from this time. But also at the same time, we see a real start of the commercial modern wine cellars, the birth of, say, Teliani Valley and also Talavi wine cellar at that time. 2003 sees the Rosé Revolution ousting President Shevardnadze. This really starts to sever the close connections that previously were faltering between Georgia and Russia. So we start to see a real deterioration of the relations with Russia. In 2005, we see focusing on organic and biodynamic viticulture beginning to develop in Georgia. And this, of course, attracts even more the attention from the West, who, of course, have been quite heavily immersed in organics and biodynamics by that point. Markets like New York and London start to really take note of Georgia. In 2006, all the way to 2013, Russia bans imports of Georgian wine as well as Moldovan, and Russia starts a propaganda war. Doesn't this sound something which is easily heard of today? This propaganda war is around things like stating that the Georgians are creating fraudulent wines with lots of pesticides and heavy metals found in the wines. Georgia, of course, suffers a blow at this point because Russia is her biggest market, but it forces Georgia to look further afield. They must go and look elsewhere. And this really is every cloud having a silver lining, because they start to find markets in places like the UK, the US, and beyond. Now, in 2008, Georgia, of course, is solidifying a very pro-Western stance, wanting to join the European Union and NATO. And that leads to even further deterioration with Russia, kicking off the Russian-Greco War, or the Russian-Georgian War, and with Russia still today occupying the independent states of Abkhazia and also South Ossetia. So kind of our northern and northwesterly points of the northern sections of Georgia. This is not something that's recognized by NATO or international. This is something that the Russians are annexing, like they frequently do. Now, in June 2010, the 33rd OIV, International Congress of Viticulture and Winemaking, is held in Georgia, and many wineries are rebuilt and renovated for this very special occasion. The National Wine Agency really starts to market and promote Georgian wines, both at home and in export markets. As well as regulating viticulture, winemaking industry through labeling, things like regulation, and of course, further restructuring of the PDOs. But the major goal is really focusing on export markets. The excellent work of the wines of Georgia in major markets like the United Kingdom has been second to none to really get to the consumer the importance of such a rich historical country for winemaking, making a real diversity of styles. It's quite breathtaking when you get really stuck into the Georgian wine side of things. 2013, UNESCO protects Kvevri, our clay pots, as intangible cultural heritage, as I mentioned previously at the start of the presentation. Okay, it's been a long section, but it is the oldest growing country for wine in the world. So there's a lot of history to go through. So hopefully you've enjoyed that historical stance. Please do join me next time for the climate and weather of this country that makes such wonderful wines, Georgia. If you do have any comments, questions, or concerns, or like I mentioned earlier, if you have any wines you've tried, if you've visited Georgia, any wineries you'd like to talk about, please put them in the comments section below this video. Make sure you click like and you click subscribe. It helps us and it helps you. And of course, if you do find yourself in the United Kingdom and you want to come to one of my classes or just enjoy a glass of wine, then please come and see me for a class, a glass, or more likely a bottle of Georgian wine. See you very soon. Bye-bye.